I'd like to welcome you all to the Sunrise County Economic Council Washington County Housing Summit. My name is Charles Rudelitch. I'm the Executive Director of the Sunrise County Economic Council. As most of you know, Sunrise County Economic Council is a nonprofit that works to create jobs and prosperity in Washington County. We are also the community development and economic development arm of Washington County government. We've been doing this work for a little over 30 years. Working with municipalities and businesses and individuals in Washington County to grow the economy. Before I start on my presentation, I just want to talk a little bit about why housing. It seems obvious, given the affordability crisis that we're in and really most of the country is in right now, particularly in the coastal sections of Maine. But I also want to talk a little bit about its role in economic development. I mean, Washington County, as you know, is an extremely rural place. We're about 32,000 people in a very large area, a little smaller than Connecticut, several times the size of Rhode Island, depending on which New England state you choose. And we're clustered in a little over 40 communities along the coast and along the Canadian border, with the vast majority of the county essentially uninhabited, or with very few year-round residents. So we're very rural. We have a unique geography because of historic facts and national borders and the way that infrastructure has been built in this part of the world. We're at the end of most networks. We're at the end of the electric grid. We're at the end of the kind of US road system, and we are barely connected to the North American rail system, really just with a teeny lifeline to Canada. So in many ways, we are very rural, we have a unique geography, and we are just not connected to the systems that facilitate economic growth. We have advantages. We have incredible beauty. We have incredibly clean and plentiful water in parts of the county, and we have access to the Gulf of Maine, which is an incredibly productive marine environment. So there are strengths in the economy, but there's a lot of weaknesses. Our ability to recruit a manufacturer with 1,000 jobs, a major new investment that isn't directly linked to a natural resource here, is really slim. We are just not competitive with places with better infrastructure and a lot more people and a more compact geography. So our economy needs to grow really through the people who are here and the people who choose to make this their home. And housing is just the key part of how that happens. It's how we retain people who grew up here or who live here now and want to stay here. It's how we attract people who didn't grow up here, but want to make this the home for themselves and their family. It also is a major part of the services we sell to the rest of the world, which is second homes. So housing plays a bunch of functions in our economy, and it's really impossible to see a route to increase prosperity and increase growth in Washington County that also doesn't include a larger housing stock and a more robust and useful housing stock than what we have right now. And I just want to talk a little bit about myself. I grew up in Washington County. I grew up on a dairy farm in Harrington. Went to Narraguagus, went away to school, eventually came back to Maine, got a degree in economics from Maine, worked actually as an intern for Sunrise County not long after it was founded, back when it still was a small startup nonprofit, and then worked for the town of Fort Kent doing community development and worked for the Passamaquoddy tribe doing community and economic development for a bit. Got my JD. I kind of realized at that point I realized I was in over my head when I was working for the Passamaquoddy tribe and decided to go back to school, got my JD, practiced law for some time in Southern Maine. And then, well, it's getting to be a while ago, in 2009, moved back to Washington County and took a job as the legal aid attorney for Washington County, the basic legal aid attorney with Pine Tree Legal. Did that work for about 5 years in the courts in Washington County and Hancock County. And during that time, I did quite a lot of mortgage defense because it was the aftermath of the Great Recession. So had a front row seat to securitization of mortgages and what that actually meant for homeowners. during a foreclosure process. And then in 2014, made the move from Pine Tree Legal to Sunrise County Economic Council. And did that, as many of you have heard, really, from my experience growing up in Washington County, I mean, this is my home, and I really, really care about what happens here. But also because my time at Pine Tree Legal just hammered home the challenges that Washington County residents are facing because the adults in their household, in their family, do not have living wage jobs, or do not have businesses, or do not own businesses that pay a living wage. And that leads to a cascade of challenges around health and security, around well-being. And Sunrise County Economic Council tries to shift the economy in Washington County so that it produces more living wage opportunities, both in employment and in entrepreneurship. And it's a work I deeply care about. I think it's work that's needed here. And work I'm thankful that I'm able to do, actually, for these 12 years. And we have, my husband and I have moved back to the family farm. I'm still in Harrington. And I just want to do that as a little bit of a base. One, because a lot of what I'm going to be talking about isn't uplifting. And it's hard to talk about the challenges we face. But it comes from, talking about family, talking about home. So I have my notes on my laptop and my presentation on a different computer. So hopefully this will work. And I'm having trouble advancing the presentation. I'm fine doing it by the screen if that will work.
Okay.
Can I just do it by
just
pressing the mouse?
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, and it's up and down rather than side to side.
Side. You can do sideways.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Jeff. So to start off, this is an overview. This just shows the population, year-round population in Washington County over the last 120 years. There's a few things I want to kind of make note of here. One is that we are a region that has been losing population for over the last century, in a pretty remarkably consistent way, despite all the dramatic changes in the economy here. There's one exception, maybe two. The one exception that you can see on this graph is the Back to the Land movement in the 70s, that increase in population between 1970 and 1980. And that shifted our demographics for a while, with a bunch of families with young kids moving in, or young people who started families moving into the region. And then that trend of decreasing year-round population kind of reasserted itself, kind of after the effects of that influx of people was beginning to wear off. It is possible that the years since 2020 mark another inflection point. That is still really uncertain. The population projections that came out like 2 years into the pandemic really showed a pretty radically increasing number of people in Washington County, including of families, kind of young adults, and a stabilizing number of children looking out into the future. As more time has gone by and some people have moved out who moved in, that picture's a little bit murkier. It does look like we are really dramatically slowing the decline, at the very least, for the next few decades. And it's possible we're shifting to a kind of population profile that will provide for slow growth. This looks at population of the county through a more recent lens and breaks it up by age cohort. Again, from the decennial census and the American Community Survey for some of the later years. There's a few things I'd note here. One, that in this period, really the dominant age class was middle-aged adults. That yellow band, the 45 to 64, with a decreasing number of children, the kind of the purple and red bands, and an increasing number, and of young adults, which is the kind of the deep green and the light green, and then an increasing number of elderly. When you look at population projections. So this is based on kind of actuals until 2022, and then goes to 2040. It looks at projections based on kind of recent trends. And this is from the Office of the State Economist in Maine. There's a few things going on here. One of which is what I'll point out is a stabilizing in the number of children, an actual increase in the number of young adults, which is a major shift from what's been happening in recent decades in Washington County, a decrease in the number of middle-aged adults, and as a natural consequence of that, a dramatic increase in the number of residents who are over 65. And it is most of that increase, almost actually all of the increase, is in residents 75 and older. And this is one thing that if there's one thing you remember from this presentation, I hope you remember that under our best understanding of current trends, there will be about 3,200 more people 75 and older living year-round in Washington County in 20 years than there are now. So a population about the size of Calais of people 75 and older, more than about a doubling of the number of kind of adults in that age range. Hopefully that doesn't affect. Good, thank you. So that is just a major shift in demographics, as you'll see later in this presentation. Well, we'll see pretty soon, actually. If you look at that population, that is of that population, a total of a little over 11,000 people. And this is a population that's not growing a lot. So about a third of the population, give or take. So a population of about 11,000 people, about 4,500 who are 65 to 74, and about 6,500 that are 75 and older. So a really dramatic change in the population profile in Washington County. This looks at our primary source of affordable housing for people who are older in Washington County, which is the USDA Section 515 Rental Assistance Program. We have a little under 530 units of 515 apartments in Washington County, all of which are eligible to lose their subsidy by 2050, and a good number, a little over 230, that are eligible to exit the program essentially now, or in very short order. So, and then the rest would be that 294 are essentially after 230, but before 250. This is assuming no major changes in federal policy, because that's uncertain, of course, whether federal policy will change. But there's been very little new construction in the last decade and a half or so, none, I believe. So there's a possibility this program is sunsetting. It is preventing, in my opinion, it is probably the single most important government action that is preventing homelessness in Washington County among the elderly and the long-term disabled. It represents about 1 in 6 rental units in Washington County and the majority of subsidized rental units. And you can see these complexes all over the county, and they're spread out, and they allow people often to live near their homes and where their family is. In my opinion, it's an extremely effective program, but one whose future isn't certain. Next few slides, I'll try to go through pretty quickly. They're mostly just about poverty rates in the county, which I actually debated whether to leave them in, because poverty is such an inadequate measure of affordability right now, given the cost. For someone in poverty, housing is unaffordable without subsidy, but it's unaffordable for a lot of people in that 2 times poverty or 3 times poverty, particularly 2 times poverty. So just to show, the rates in general in Washington County cluster in the high teens. When we're looking just at poverty, people 65 years and older are the least likely to be in poverty. the most likely are children. This looks at families rather than individuals. Again, biggest risk factor, and then where you get rates over 30% are having a young child in the household. So a related child under 5. And this looks at essentially single moms, or census terminology, female householder, no spouse present, and where you can see rates that, tend to be, towards between 40 and 50%, particularly for households with children and young children. Now, these are 5-year moving averages, and the refundable tax credits that were part of a response to the pandemic did shift these numbers quite a bit for families with young children. And you can kind of see that effect, and that effect leveling off. That effect will, of course, go away as we move further away from that public policy intervention. This slide looks at the economy as a whole. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about economic sectors in Washington County, but I felt that it's a useful, just when you keep in mind like the value of the housing stock, it's useful to just remember kind of the size of the economy. This is measured in personal income. It's a bit clunky, but it is a federal measure that's published for the entire country at the county level. And I think it's actually quite accurate when it comes to the value of wages and self-employment and investment income. I think it's deceptive when it talks about transfer payments, just because the vast majority of our transfer payments are payments from Medicaid and Medicare for Washington County residents, where those payments just happen somewhere else. They happen in Bangor or Portland or Boston, or most of them are going to a pharmaceutical company. So really only the retail slice is part of the Washington County economy. And with mail order, maybe not even that. So that green line is pretty deceptive, but the red and blue, you can kind of see the size of the economy. Depending on how you look at it, we're about a 1 billion to 1.2. If you look at it as a GDP measure to the extent you can at a county level, that's useful. And if you look at personal income, we're towards 1.5 billion, kind of an annual size.
That's adjusted for inflation?
Yes. Yeah, and it's a little dated. It's in $2024, but of course it goes back to 1969. Yeah. So, but there's a pretty long delay in the publishing of these numbers too. This is retail sales in constant $20-$25 in Washington County, monthly taxable retail sales, divided up by economic statistical area in the county. It's not actually here to talk about retail sales. I just want to talk about seasonality. Seasonality is just a major feature of Washington County's economy and something that's a complicating factor in anything, and particularly in housing affordability. We just have huge swings in economic activity here between kind of that January to March period and summer and fall. And that's from the tourism industry, the summer home industry, and the fishing industry we have several things and agriculture that are all pushing that trend. So going back to housing, this is a graph that breaks up the value of the owner-occupied units in Washington County by age of householder. I'm actually not sure this is that important for age, but I wanted to have something that would show the value, which is about a little under 2.4 billion. And this is 2024 dollars. And it's inflation adjusted over a 5-year moving average, like most things in the American Community Survey. So a relatively small portion, a little under $190 million of that are homes where the owner is 35 years or younger. Of course, the bulk of about 1.19 billion in value is held by adults 35 to 64, and about 994 million in value in the housing stock is held by residents who are 65 and older. And for me, it was just helpful to think of the housing stock as, less than 2 years economic output, or about 2 years of economic output for the county, just getting a sense of the size and the type of ocean liner we're trying to shift here with public policy innovations that are often measured in the hundreds of thousands or the low millions. And we're trying to shift something that is worth multiple billions. It is an argument that I definitely, for me, has just pointed out to just the key point of the private sector and its ability to mobilize money at a different scale than the public sector is right now in dealing with our housing stock over time. Housing units by type. So this graph is problematic in a few ways because I don't understand why it went down between the decennial census and the American Community Survey moving averages. I think there may have been some flaws either in the sampling methodology with the American Community Survey or things that came out in 2020. I'm not exactly sure why we had that drop in units. But the trend that I hope to convey still comes through, which is when we're talking about housing stock, we are talking about single family homes in Washington County primarily, and we are talking about mobile homes and apartments, with mobile homes actually being a more important sector than apartments for the number of units that they're providing in the county. So just thinking about the housing stock overall, of course, this includes all housing units, so this will include seasonal homes as well, which in Washington County are about a third of units. So that skews things a bit. But we are mostly talking about single family homes in Washington County. This looks at housing units by use, where seasonal use, which I think this might be a bit of an underestimation, but you can kind of see where they go between seasonal, other vacant, of course, for sale and rent, and migrant worker housing. I think this is an undercount. It's in the low 20s, and I just think there's more units out there. But not that it would shift the size of the bar that much. Again, one of the unique dynamics, well, unique compared to the nation, not unique compared to rural Maine, that Washington County has is that the people who live here year round are not the only people competing for spaces in the housing stock. We are competing with space in the housing stock with people from across the country and to some degree across the world, but particularly across the country, particularly the mid-Atlantic states and southern New England, who are really the majority of our second homeowners. So we both have the dynamic of supply and demand. Supply is a function of how many housing units we can create in the county relative to population growth. It is also a function of how many units are being used for seasonal use, for short-term rentals, how many units are being used for year-round use. So we have two dynamics working at the same time. Looking at the occupied portion, so essentially the year-round housing stock or use in Washington County of a little over 14,000 units, over 11,000 of those are owner-occupied, little under 2,900 are renter-occupied. And this looks at median household income of those owner-occupied and renter-occupied units. Owner-occupied is a little over $66,000 a year for median household income, and these are 2024 numbers. And renter-occupied are a little under $27,000 a year in median household income. According to some of the data compiled by Maine State Housing Authority, about 52% of renting households in Washington County are cost burden. And this median household income for renter-occupied houses translates to an affordable rent of about $670 a month, which has not existed widespread in Washington County for a decade or more. So we are definitely seeing, as I think we all know, that particularly for renting households in Washington County, there's just a real gap for most renting households in Washington County, there is a gap between income and rent unless there's a subsidy. This looks at, again, taking down that, about 2,900 of renter-occupied housing units, A little under 1,300 are single-family homes. A little over 1,300 are apartments, and mobile homes are a little over 200. So this is a place where apartments start really mattering. When you look at the housing stock as a whole, they're a pretty minor contributor, but you look at the housing stock that's available for rent and that renting households use, for housing, apartments start becoming really important. I will note that 1,372 apartments, that 500 and some 515 apartments are just a major chunk of that. So again, when you think of the landscape of rental apartments in Washington County, one of the reasons why we don't see a lot of homelessness, or more homelessness than we do see some here, is because of those unit-connected subsidies that are available through the USDA 515 program, and to a lesser extent, the HUD-funded kind of complex-related subsidies that are really right now filling a gap. It's why we don't have widespread homelessness in Washington County to a greater degree than we do. Or population loss, which is people may move out of the region for services if they didn't exist here. Next few graphs just look at what's happened since the pandemic and the Great Recession, just around housing costs. This looks at single-family home median sales price adjusted to $20-25. You can see, starting in 2008, you can kind of see that more than gradual decline in the real value of homes being sold as measured by median sales price. After the Great Recession, really to the mid-2010s, then a recovery that starts then, that was well underway before the pandemic, and then just a dramatic step with the pandemic. And then if you account for inflation, a leveling off since then. Inflation has been so extreme during some years since the pandemic, it just seems like the prices are going up very quickly. But when adjusted for inflation, those costs have been relatively stable in the last few years after that initial jump. This looks at the number of sales, a market that was essentially frozen in the years after the Great Recession, that gradually recovered to, about 400 a year, a little under 350 to 400 a year, big spike. Interestingly enough, leading up to the pandemic, where the pandemic was not a factor in 2019. So something was already happening in the housing market here that, of course, the pandemic seems to have amplified. And then it's honestly settled down, which again was not a result I expected to see. Could be based on just the amount of stock that was available for sale during those years rather than a decrease in demand. But we definitely have seen the number settle out a bit in the last few years. This looks at single-family home median sale price adjusted to $20-25 for several different regions of Maine. Washington County is the red line, Hancock County is the green line, Aroostook County is light blue, and Cumberland is the navy blue. I was really trying to get at whether Washington County was like making the transition, gentrifying, becoming more like Southern Maine. When you look at housing prices, that's actually not what's happening. We are increasing at the same rate as Southern Maine. We are not catching up. If anything, the gap in actual dollars is getting larger between the value of a home in Cumberland County and the value of a home in Washington County. So we're, again, moving in lockstep, keeping our relative position as the cheap place to own a home on the coast of Maine relative to the other coastal counties. That may shift. It's not a result I expected. I honestly expected us to be kind of taking the mid-coast path where we're moving up and converging with Southern Maine, but that does not appear to where we are. And I will point out just that Aroostook County, and I think a lot of inland Maine, is on a different path. So its housing costs are increasing at a lower rate than in the coastal counties. This graph just looks at relative change. So 2010 is 1, and then the relative change, again, accounting for inflation through 2025, You can see some variation, but 3 coastal counties in this graph moving as a block and Aroostook County moving kind of differently. This is where the trouble comes in. This looks at the inflation-adjusted value of median household income. And this is the year-round population, because we're talking about people who are counted in the census. So that's gone up at best by about 20% in Cumberland County and by much lower amounts in Washington and Hancock and Aroostook. So just a major problem. And as you can see in the next graph, actually, oh, there's a missing slide. I apologize. On my laptop, there's a slide that shows the just the way that it shows that difference. That in Washington County, the median sales price has almost doubled, while the median household income has increased by about 10%. And thus the affordability challenge. This looks at affordability in a different way. This is the household income needed to purchase a median value home without being cost burdened versus the actual median household income by town in Washington County. And you can see for many towns, for some towns, they're pretty close together. For some towns, they are just way out of whack. Machias Port being the outstanding example here of where the income needed to purchase the median sale price home in that town is twice what the median household income is in that town. That, of course, this is just reflecting the fact that year-round residents are not driving these costs, or not driving these prices. You can see in this graph, it's where a lot of the housing stock is being used as seasonal homes and as part of essentially probably a East Coast market for seasonal homes, which is moving with the purchasing ability of the East Coast population of people who have second homes, rather than moving with the purchasing power of the people who live here year-round. Something we all know, we just know some places are unaffordable along the coast of Maine unless you have family money or income from outside. And you can see that dynamic is definitely true in Washington County. So the next few slides, which I apologize, have gone a little longer than I anticipated, are really about a housing dashboard that we are going to be releasing to the public shortly. That is the outcome of the Housing Opportunity Program kind of planning effort that Sunrise County Economic Council has been engaged in for a little over a year. And our planning effort really was trying to get at the potential for new housing development in parts of Washington County that are already served by public water or public sewer, or in the case of Jonesport, in a service center community that is talking about developing public water. So they're a bit of an outlier. The other communities actually have existing public water or public sewer systems. They vary a great deal in capacity. Some, like East Machias or Millbridge, have very little capacity, particularly in their wastewater systems, for expansion right now. Some, like Calais, Machias, Eastport, Lubec, have a lot of capacity to absorb new uses and to expand. The same is true of Baileyville. But these are the communities. And Danforth, I actually am not sure of whether there are constraints. I know they're rebuilding their water system now, so I assume there will be more capacity there. I'm not sure about the nature of their wastewater treatment, whether that's constrained or not. The dashboard looks at several, well, you can see here, for each of those targeted communities, there are several layers that can be turned on and off. This, of course, is Calais. as you can see by that bend, distinctive bend in the river. And you can toggle on and off short-term rentals. We used AirDNA data, so I think that's Airbnb and Vrbo rentals. So it doesn't include the whole universe of short-term rentals, but at least gives a thought of where they are in the county and where they're having a significant impact. And there also are, actual maps of those sewer and water systems, as well as what we've been able to compile on information on dilapidated housing, latent housing parcels, and several other, and home ownership too. I'll just go through the next. There are a few screenshots to give an illustration of what this will show. So this one looks at home ownership in Calais, where local owner, so this is essentially about where the tax bills are mailed to. So if they're mailed to the address, we assumed it was a local owner. And then in-state non-resident or out-of-state non-resident, of course, of Calais, is where we looked at the triangle and the diamond shape. At this scale, it does give a picture. You can zoom, which gives a better sense. Tax card data can lag a bit, so it's not perfect. But this definitely gives a sense of, this again is the village center in Calais, dominated by owner-occupied units. Where if you look at some of the other communities, particularly like Lubec or Eastport, you really see a different pattern, particularly in the village center. And this next is just a bit of a confusing graph that is available in that dashboard, or will be available in that dashboard, that looks at the active short-term rentals by community. This does not look at cumulative, which are much higher. But as you can see, some communities, such as Calais, Baileyville, really not impacted to a huge degree relative to their housing stock. Same is true as Danforth, in the town limits of Danforth, but definitely more of an impact for Millbridge, Eastport, Lubec, places that are much more impacted by the role of short-term rentals. And right now there's about 180 short-term rentals that we believe are active based on this data set in the county, about 350 cumulative over the time period we looked at. One thing I will note, at least in the data set we have access to, there is a huge amount of churn. Very few of these units stay short-term rentals for 5 years. So that could be because we looked at over the pandemic period, and the advantages of just selling a home probably became much more attractive relative to keeping it as a short-term rental. But that is something to know, that it is a significant number given the size of our housing stock, but measured in the hundreds, not in the thousands. And there's a lot of churn, but it is very significant for a few village centers on the coast, where it isn't just something that's a small percentage that kind of, is having some impact. It's probably having a major impact on the housing market, again, in Lubec and Eastport, and to some degree, Millbridge. So this looks, okay, short-term rentals in Baileyville. So 8 active. So you can see clustered along the lake frontage, a few in the village. This looks at Millbridge. With these 2 companies, about 37 active in 2025. Of course, there are a lot that we are not mapping that are being just offered by individuals who are doing the booking themselves or working through other services. So this looks at kind of available housing in a way, or at least housing to look at. This is a Dublin Street in Machias, and you can see, tax acquired property, probate, property currently in probate, municipally owned property, and dilapidated housing. And for that, we looked at housing that was abandoned, but not in the legal sense. Not just homes that are being lived in, but have a lot of deferred maintenance. And This, I believe, looks at short-term rentals in Eastport. So again, you can see just a much more, am I right about that? Yes. Yeah, short-term rentals in Eastport. Again, you can see just a lot of concentration in the village center there. So any questions? And I apologize, I've gone a little longer than I intended, so there's less time, but I think there's some flexibility in the schedule.
Yeah, no, thanks. This is interesting for so many reasons. I'm curious about a slide or just speaking to compared housing prices across different counties. I'm curious about the change in the price. How about comparison around rental prices across those counties? What we're hearing anecdotally is that the price of an apartment in Washington County is literally the same as it is in Oxford County, Bangor Centric, and in the state.
And that definitely is doable. I have not done that. But with the housing data dashboard that Maine State Housing Authority maintains, there is a way that when you look at renting occupied households, you can get information on cost burden percentages, which isn't perfect, but because that's comparing median rents to median household income of renting households, would be a window into that. And that is on the county level. So it wouldn't be difficult at all to look at Penobscot County and Hancock County and make that comparison. We've heard the same thing of people, of housing being about the same cost or more affordable in Bangor, with, of course, the income prospects being a lot better. Jacob?
It's under the USDA 515. It's pretty important. So when they time out, what happens? Are there ways? Do they just exit? The owners just exit the program, or is there potential to re-enroll? I don't know.
I believe we have a expert or becoming an expert with Tom, who's actually trying to do this. So it is possible, if they're sold and financed through USDA, to kind of extend the life of the subsidy for the life of that mortgage, if the new owner enrolls. And honestly, if you would ask me 10 years what was going to happen, I would have thought every unit in Washington County, except maybe a few with a view of the ocean, were going to re-enroll, because the rents that were available through the USDA program were much better and more certain than the rents that were available in the private market. That is not true anymore. The market rents are higher than the subsidized rents that the 515 program are paying right now. And there is definitely a possibility that in a lot of the towns between Steuben and Cutler, that those units could be absorbed by the market. So I'm not sure what will happen now. And I'm really worried that some of those big developments, like in Cherryfield, could shift over into the market depending on what happens once they're eligible to leave the program. And once the owner decides to sell, because those are, the two things are linked.
I'll just say one thing about that, Charles. There's several different paths, of course, but one of them is a transfer of ownership to a nonprofit organization, which we're working on now with the Genesis Fund, to ensure that that housing project stays affordable for the foreseeable future. So one possible path to preserving those units.
Going back to the dashboard in your economic opportunity program, can you go down or sort or show vacant lots or large lots with room for additional dwelling units, do that kind of an analysis?
We have not done that. So we haven't looked at the potential of auxiliary dwelling units it can be done. We've had to ground truth a lot of this, which is doable on the scale that we're working. And I do think that, I don't know. I think that may have some possibilities in Washington County. We do not have the restrictions on the zoning-based restrictions on that might exist in other parts, or used to exist in other parts of the state. We have a challenge around the income of renting households. So the cost to develop a unit and the rent that needs to be charged to develop that unit becomes really challenging. I do think it probably plays a big role even now in meeting housing where there's a subsidy provided by a family member. So essentially you have a subsidized unit. That's because one member of a family is, shouldering some costs that allows the rent in a auxiliary dwelling unit to be cheaper for another member of the family. And I think that's happening all over Washington County in a way that we haven't counted and we don't have a number on. I think for at least half of the Washington County rental households, and probably a little more, just being able to pay fair market rent is a huge challenge. And of course, that gets linked to the cost of developing those units.
So on that note, the cost of developing the units, can you talk a little bit about the workforce constraints in new development or rehabilitation of existing units?
Yeah, this is based on communications with contractors rather than hard data. We hear constantly when we're speaking with contractors that one of really the major barrier to expansion is available workforce. And that of course is linked to the cost of housing, because there isn't a lot of available housing in our communities, which makes it very hard for someone to move here with those skill sets and move into that industry, or to move here at all, honestly, for many households. We also have the competition with the lobster fishery, which varies a lot in year in its profitability. And I believe we have a lot of people who move between working as sternmen and working as workers for contractors in the construction industry based on really the available opportunities at any one time. And that may be less of a factor, honestly, with the lobster fishery being less profitable in recent years. Of course, we don't know what the future will bring. But in the past, during those years where the lobster fishery was extremely profitable, that was definitely a factor in that it just was drawing in a lot of that available workforce. It is a major constraint. I think there also is just the difference between managing a 1-person operation or a 1 to 5 person operation and managing a 50-person operation. They're very different jobs. So I think there's some barriers there in just what owners want and want to do. But I think the most important constraint is available workforce. And sorry, Mark, one more.
You showed the slide that showed the difference in housing costs in Washington County and so on. My assumption is that really doesn't tell the story of the coastal communities and, Grand Lake Stream and some of those where you have a lot of seasonal housing. Is the problem more severe in those areas? And if so, how do you deal with that?
It is. And at least this is not backed by data that we have. But my observation is that the pandemic represented a pivot point in where the seasonal home market used to be you had to see wind. You had to be on the ocean or on a lake. And it seems like there's a decent number of seasonal homes that are now in village centers on postage stamp lots, which feels very new to me than what I grew up with and what I observed until the pandemic. So I do think it has always been a factor in coastal towns. It never occurred to me growing up that I would live on Ripley Neck. It felt like that could have been on the moon for a place where I would ever expect to own a home. The kind of coastal part of Harrington, I just assumed if I lived in Harrington, I'd be living, maybe on a marsh, but probably inland. And I think most people who grow up in Washington County, if they don't have family that already owns land on the ocean and are fishermen, is what they assume. But it does feel like there's more competition for those lots in coastal towns, or those houses in coastal towns that do not have water views in recent years, both for short-term rentals and as seasonal homes. So I apologize for going a little bit over. I do need to have a few more logistics I want to talk about. One thing that I neglected to do was to thank our kind of funder and sponsor for today's event, The work that underlies this presentation and underlies the dashboard was funded by the Maine Office of Community Affairs as part of a housing opportunity planning program grant that SCEC has been working under for over a year. And also that this summit is sponsored by Scythe Supply, which is a business in Perry that sells European style size, which they offered to sponsor, which we are not used to doing, but we deeply appreciate. Excellent. Thank you.